Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today on the program, we look at Project Censored's State of the Free Press 2025. It is the new book out from Project Censored, published by the Censored Press and Seven Stories Press, and I am delighted today in this segment to have with us on the program to talk about State of the Free Press 2025, two of the co-editors, Shealeigh Voitl and Andy Lee Roth. Shealeigh Voitl is Project Censored's digital and print editor. First began her research with the project at North Central College alongside Steve Masick, longtime contributor to the project, co-authoring the Deja Vu News chapter in State of the Free Press 2022 and 23, as well as our Top 25 chapter in State of the Free Press 2023. In addition to her editorial contributions to the yearbook series and work with the Campus Affiliates program, Shealeigh helped develop State of the Free Press 2024's teaching guide and the project's Critical Media Literacy in Action social media series. Her writing has been featured in Truth Out, The Progressive, and Ms. Magazine, among other places. Shealeigh Voitl, welcome to the Project Censored Show.
Mickey, thanks for having me.
It is wonderful to have you, Shealeigh. And of course, let's welcome back Andy Lee Roth, the Associate Director of Project Censored, co-editor of the State of the Free Press yearbook series, co-author of The Media and Me, A Guide to Critical Media Literacy for Young People. Andy helps coordinate the project's Campus Affiliates program, which gives hands-on critical media literacy training for students at colleges and universities across North America. Also, 2024 fellowship from the Reynolds Journalism Institute supports Andy's current project on algorithmic literacy for journalists. And regular listeners to the program will know we just had Andy on not long ago talking about that very important fellowship that he's doing for RJI. Andy's research and writing have been published in numerous outlets, including Index on Censorship, In These Times, Yes Magazine, Truth Out, The Progressive, many, many more. He holds a PhD from UCLA in sociology. Roth serves on the boards of the Media Freedom Foundation, Weave News, and of course, the Censored Press. Andy, welcome back to the program. And please uncensor yourself.
Thanks so much, Mickey. I'm thrilled to be on the air with you and Shealeigh today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's wonderful to have you both on. And so we are the co-editors of the latest book here, which is State of the Free Press 2025. There's a foreword by Manar Adlai from Mint Press News. Really another action-packed book this year. Shealeigh Voitl, this is the first year that you've done full editing on the entire book. Your name is on the cover this year. Give us a little overview. What are some of the main things that sort of stand out to you in this year's State of the Free Press volume?
Yeah, well, I mean, during a year, of many legislative and other attacks on media freedom and journalists, this year's book talks a lot about, where we've been and where we're going, even before we knew that Trump would be in office by the time our book was published, which poses obviously serious threats to press freedom and democracy. Robin Anderson in this year's news abuse chapter has provided extensive and thorough analysis of Israel's attack on Gaza, corporate media is perpetuating harmful propaganda, and the grave risk to Palestinian journalists. Our Deja Vu News chapter looks back on stories concerning the repression of Palestinian media, blacklisting of pro-Palestinian activists and others. This year's Junk Food News chapter reminds us of, what we saw a lot of in the media this year, namely anything to do with the Barbie movie or Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, and then also what corporate media neglected as a result, which this year were the thousands of women and girls in Gaza lacking basic sanitary and menstrual products, and the planet destroying CO2 emissions that private planes flown by billionaires such as Swift and even more often other super wealthy individuals dump into the atmosphere year round. So I guess, this year, not unlike other years, we're thinking about, how the past influences the present and what's, on the horizon.
So again, like I said earlier, a lot of stuff in this year's volume. Andy Lee Roth, let's go over to you. One of the main themes, of course, for the book, we've long riffed on the late great Ben Begdickian. Media power is political power, and of course, so much of that theme is threaded through the book this year. Andy, same kind of question to you. Give us kind of an overview, some of the highlights, some things that really stand out to you in State of the Free Press 2025.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we do every year, of course, is publish a list of the year's most important but underreported stories. The news that didn't make the news, as founder Carl Jensen liked to call it. And just riffing on that Bagdickian quote about media power is political power, another stalwart of kind of critical media analysis is the sociologist Gay Tuckman, who way back in 1978 observed that the power to keep an occurrence out of the news is power over the news. And so, in terms of stories that are out of the news, as far as the establishment is concerned, we have another batch of remarkable stories led by the reports from Truth Out and People's Dispatch that thousands of American workers were killed or injured on the job, with significant racial disparities in those deaths and injuries. That's our number one story this year. And then another story reported by The Guardian and The Conversation about the ways that saltwater intrusion threaten U.S. fresh water supplies. Another one of our very top stories of the year that I suspect even listeners to this program will be unlikely to have heard about, except for these very important and significant reports by, say, The Guardian and The Conversation on this topic. So every year, as regular listeners of this program know, Project Censored involves college students and their faculty mentors from across the country to identify, vet, and track these important but underreported stories. And of course, one highlight of the State of the Free Press 2025 yearbook is what is in effect the 49th cohort of students to do this work, this important work in critical media literacy and informing the public, with the upshot of Project Censored shining for a 49th time the spotlight on these important stories that, for one reason or another, the establishment press either missed or blockaded.
So, Andy Lee Roth, I'm not a mathematician, but that looks like 1,225 stories total. If you go back to 1976, that's quite a number of stories in terms of the news that doesn't make the news. And then, of course, you being the project's campus coordinator for the affiliates program, working on what we call the validated independent news stories. These are the submissions that students and professors send in. Can you talk a little bit maybe about that process? And Shealeigh, we want to bring you back in too, maybe to weigh in on some of these related matters. But we usually get quite a number of stories in to look at, Andy. Usually well over 100, sometimes even double that. They're vetted, they're checked many, many times. Can you talk a little bit about the process? And of course, you also write the intro to the top 25 stories, and you notice patterns, patterns of omission. Maybe you could say a few things to our listeners about what they might expect to see on the list this year.
Yeah, let me say a little bit about those patterns of omission and the kind of the historical perspective that 49 years of tracking censored stories represents. And then Shealeigh can maybe say a little bit about, because she's definitely involved in the vetting process herself. She can say a little bit about the story review process, story review and selection process. So one of the things that we point out in this year's book is that, of course, every story on the top 25 list is important in its own right, but that the full significance of those stories can only be seen by thinking of them as a whole. And then beyond this year's list, thinking of these 49 years of tracking, in effect, censored stories allows us to see patterns of omission, as you say. And one of the things that I think comes very clear and that we talk about in the introduction to the top 25 chapter of the yearbook is best summarized by another sociologist who was doing critical work on the news back in the 70s. And when I mention people like Gay Tuckman and now Barbara Phillips, it's important to remember these people in some ways, for people who are buffs around kind of critical news studies, these studies by Tuckman and Barbara Phillips, who I'll mention more in a moment, actually predate the propaganda model, Chomsky, Herman and Chomsky, Bakdickian's work. So it was Barbara Phillips who, back in 1976, the year that Project Censored was founded, said that she observed that news gives us the feeling of novelty without change. And that's an interesting thing to just pause and think about, the impression of novelty without change. And 50 years on, almost 50 years on, I think that pattern still holds for a lot of what passes as news in the corporate media. And it's one reason that so many Americans hold the beliefs that, for example, gridlock is inevitable, that corporate dominance is inescapable, and that substantive reform is a pipe dream. And I think each of those factors, without going into, kind of hot takes on the recently completed presidential election, each of those notions that gridlock, would there always be gridlock, there always be corporate dominance of our airwaves and media systems, that there can't be substantive reform. Each of those is fueled in some ways by the stories that corporate media choose to focus on, how they frame those stories, which is something Shealeigh and I have a lot to say about, and what is excluded from the kind of story agenda, the news agenda by the corporate media.
Absolutely.
So when we talk about like what we're doing with the top 25 story list every year is pointing out individually important stories, but also showing that there are these patterns. And just to name one, like anything, and I'll speak here as a kind of someone trained and steeped in thinking sociologically about our news media. Anything that involves systemic social problems, right? Things that can't be solved by individual initiatives are likely to be given short shrift in the corporate media because the news values of kind of traditional journalism focus on important individuals and their actions. And the idea that there are systems at work, systems of inequality, like social structural systems, are difficult for journalists to report because they don't happen in ways that are manifest on a day-to-day basis. They don't operate in ways. And so, one of our judges, Bob Hackett up in Canada, has this great line about that for corporate media, for establishment press, news is about what went wrong today, but not what goes wrong every day. And the stories that feature in the top 25 story list this year, and I think year after year, are stories about what's going wrong every day because they're driven not by individual choices, but by systemic problems and inequalities.
Yeah, absolutely. Shealeigh Voitl, very well put, Andy, and a great overview and some themes to think about as you also every year in the book with the top story. Shealeigh Voitl, let's bring you in and discuss a little bit more since you've been really intimately involved in the process and looking and vetting the stories, certainly editing, right, and looking at what's happening. There's a lot of vetting that goes on, checking and rechecking and then checking again for accuracy to see if the corporate media comes around to picking things up. Every year, there's a story or two or three that we think is a hot looking story, and then the corporate media cover it. Or sometimes students will they'll do the research and then they'll be disappointed when they find out the corporate media has covered their particular story. But that's not a disappointing part of that assignment. That means that the establishment press is really doing the job of trying to inform the public about key stories that Andy was just riffing on themes about that tend not to be in the news. But Shealeigh, tell us a little bit more your thoughts about that process.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's quite cool to be on the other side of it. I was once a student that was doing a VIN assignment in my college classroom, and now, I see the submissions that we get every year from faculty and students. And yeah, they go through a rigorous process of vetting initially by Andy and I to check for importance, timeliness, quality of sources, obviously coverage by the corporate media. If it's in the New York Times, this is something that would disqualify that story. But then, these stories then are, identified by us as validated independent news stories. We send them off to those same faculty and students and our esteemed panel of judges, educators, journalists, who then narrow, hundreds of stories, over 100 stories down to 25. And then those 25 stories are then ranked by those same panel of judges again. But before that, also Project Censored interns are then tasked with investigating those stories even further, making sure that they weren't covered in the time in between by corporate media, checking again the same things that we initially checked, quality of sources, fact checking, and then obviously then it's sent to the panel of judges to vote again. So it is a very rigorous process, and it's illuminating, obviously, I think, for students to see these, like Andy said, patterns of omission. I know it was for me. I've talked about it, I think, on this show before, but it allows you to see the news in a different way, and certainly it certainly sticks forever. And now on this side of it, I see these same themes, these clusters of stories, environmental issues, labor issues. Now this year, a lot of big tech, social media censorship that we see over and over again. And that's no coincidence. So yeah, the process is thorough, and we end up with a stellar, top 25 list of independent reporting.
Yeah, and Andy, you mentioned we have maybe a minute or two before the need to take a break, but you mentioned earlier again about these patterns, and you mentioned that even listeners of this show or people that find themselves being news savvy, there's something on the top 25 list this year, as each year, that even the most savvy people miss, right, and don't pick up on, and maybe one of those things too. We also try to cover solution stories or positive kinds of stories. Maybe you could mention, something out of that from this year's book on the list, something that maybe points to certain things happening that are let's say heartening, or something that give us hope that there are some things happening in the future. I know just past the presidential election season. I'm speaking to you all at the end of November. This program will air after the first week of December. The book's out December 3rd. But maybe you want to mention some of that, because it's not all gloom and doom.
Yes, indeed. I think solution stories are another of those categories that are almost systemically marginalized by the corporate press. And we could talk for a whole program about the reasons why that's so. But I think one of them, this is my personal opinion now, is that solution stories empower people. And a lot of the corporate media, Fox is perhaps the exemplar of this, seem to operate on a ratings-driven, keep people on the edge of their seats and anxious. And solution stories can quell that anxiety by providing models and exemplars of instances where communities of people are coming together to address those systemic social problems that I was talking about earlier. Here's one example from this year's story list. Hospital school programs are supporting students' mental health and education. We know, those of us who work in the area of media literacy know that young people are experiencing unprecedented levels of mental health crises. And many of them end up hospitalized. And in a number of cases, that means that those young people as students will fall behind in their coursework and their education, further exacerbating the anxieties and stresses that they have to deal with. These hospital school programs are providing a solution to at least that component of the problem. And there's fantastic reporting from the Hechinger Report, an independent news outlet that focuses on education issues. And this is a story that was brought forward to the project by our colleague, Allison Butler, at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and students working in her in the course she teaches on education that always has a critical media literacy angle. So that's another story that people can look for. It's worth pointing out here, I know we just don't have enough time to talk in depth about the great diversity of the book, but all the top 25 stories from this year's book and the entire archive of 49 years of those stories are all available at no charge on the Project Censored website, projectcensored.org. So people interested in learning more about these stories, getting a preview of what's in the story list for the State of the Free Press 2025 can point your browser to the Project Censored website, and you will find a wealth of information and indeed inspiring stories of the solutions type that remind us that media power is political power, and we, the people, can seize that power.
That's Lee Roth, Associate Director of Project Censored, with Shealeigh Voitl, our digital print editor, both co-editors of Project Censored's latest book, State of the Free Press 2025, out by Censored Press and Seven Stories Press. We're going to continue our conversation with Voitl and Roth after this brief musical break. Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today in the program, we are joined by Shealeigh Voitl and Lee Roth, co-editors of State of the Free Press 2025. The first part there, we were just speaking about the new book, State of the Free Press 2025. But earlier this year, in August, they put together a really extensive guide called Beyond Fact Checking, a teaching guide to the power of news frames. And this is a really detailed report. It's almost 60 pages that has lesson plans. It connects to Common Core. It's absolutely amazing resource for teachers and people, that want to infuse critical media literacy into their curriculum, into their classroom. You both write in the beginning, current media literacy efforts place great emphasis on fact checking as a means to counter misinformation and disinformation. Without a doubt, fact checking, the process of confirming the factual accuracy of certain statements or claims, is fundamental to becoming a more proactive and discerning media user. So write Voitl and Roth. But you both go beyond this, right? You say fact checking is often taught in terms of lateral reading. So I want to hear you all define some of these terms. News slant is another. And then, of course, what do we mean by news frames and frame checking? So Shealeigh Voitl, we can certainly start with you, and we can get into some details here in the time we have left on the program. Shealeigh, what's frame checking and why does it matter?
Yeah, well, so I guess to start, in order to kind of understand frame checking, we talk a lot about fact checking, and it is important to combat misinformation and disinformation, and it's often taught, by way of lateral reading, which you mentioned, and we kind of know it as opening multiple tabs while you're reading an article. It's, the process of conducting sort of multiple online searches to determine a source's trustworthiness. And it is a useful skill. Fact checking is vital, but it's not, a sufficient means of providing media users with, sort of the full picture. Facts can be proven, but how do you go about detecting news slant, which is more subtle and easier to miss? So frame checking involves scrutinizing these news narratives as potential forms of news slant, determining which perspectives are downplayed while others are emphasized. And this guide provides some of those tools to evaluate, how things like context, quotations, photos, headlines, and so on, sort of work together to shape how a viewer or reader, comes to understand a story. And it's important to be critical of each of those components. And this guide can sort of help us get in the practice of doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is such an important guide, and frame checking is something, again, I've been using the guide in my class this fall. It's really useful, and students have responded to it really well. So obviously, you all were filling a need, that we really need to focus on this. Andy Lee Roth. So how did you and Shealeigh sort of cook up this idea that this is something that needed to be done?
Well, I mean, part of it is that framing is a central kind of concept in, the sociology of news production and in communications that are studies that are critical of news, examining news as for its propagandistic effects. The idea of news frames being, the central idea or the primary storyline that organizes all of the information in a story and gives it meaning is a core kind of conceptual foundation for the sociology of news and other disciplines where there's critical inquiry into news. So that's the deep background. But it was a little over a year ago, October 20 of 23, that all of us, a bunch of the team from Project Censored, were in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at the University of Pennsylvania for the Union for Democratic Communications semi-annual conference. And Shealeigh and I were coming out of a session that had been focused on critical media literacy. And we were with our colleague, Cynthia Sandler, who's a middle and high school teacher in Connecticut with a focus on media literacy. And Cynthia said kind of in passing, I don't think I'm telling any secrets here. She turned to Shealeigh and he said, she's so tired of educators who say, well, we've done lateral reading. That's all there is to media literacy. And then they move on to the next thing. And Shealeigh, I think, if I'm remembering right, picked up on like Cynthia's sort of exasperated take on that, candid, exasperated take. And we were talking a few days later, and she said, we need frame checking. And I was like, whoa, that's genius. And I guess, what we didn't think at the time. So this is back in like late October, early November of 2023. We basically spent the next 8 to 10 months developing this curriculum, this teaching guide. We did so in consultation with a bunch of teachers. Cynthia, who I mentioned in the kind of origin story here, gave us invaluable feedback. So did our Media Freedom Foundation colleague, Ben Boyington, and Allison Butler, who's an expert in critical media literacy and faculty at University of Massachusetts Amherst, as I mentioned earlier. In consultation with them, we developed this curriculum, which really consists of 6 distinct lesson plans, each of which can stand on its own, but which can also be taught in sequence to provide basically a full curriculum around framing and frame checking. And I don't think when we started, I mean, I'll smile as I say this, Shealeigh, we'll see if she smiles too. I think we had no idea how long it would take us to develop this. It's really almost like we've written a small textbook, but it's written in a way that people don't have to read an entire book. They can dive into the unit that makes the most sense to them. And for each lesson plan, we have a 1-page checklist. This was part of the advice we got from classroom teachers, was like, show it to me on 1 page that I can print out and take into the classroom and use. And so it's really kind of plug and play. Like each checklist the checklist for each lesson plan includes a listing of the key concepts for that lesson, a handful of activities that can be done in the period in a single class period, and then quick writing feedback that students can give on their way out the door to set up a successful follow-up lesson the next time.
Shealeigh Voitl, let's talk a little bit about what some of the lessons are, what's in the guide, and something that you all call the PAGE model, Page. Shealeigh Voitl.
Yeah, so we developed our PAGE model, which draws on research by media scholar Robert Entman. And it provides like a structured approach to evaluating news coverage. It's a 4-step process by which students are asked to consider how the news pinpoints the problem, analyzes the cause of the problem, gauges moral solutions, and examines solutions. And these questions can, really sharpen the differences across coverage of a particular issue, encouraging students to look, beyond surface level reporting. And this process can be done right after reading the summary lead of a news story. The answers to these questions can be really telling, as they're strong indicators of bias, especially considering where blame is being assigned. And this deeper analysis can help students understand, how framing influences public perception and decision-making, and hopefully empowering them to engage more critically with the media that they consume. But also, another one of our lessons, is encourages students to consider the context of a story by constructing a timeline of coverage to track how the treatment of the issue has evolved over time across both corporate news media and independent news media. And for this activity, we actually chose the COVID pandemic, where the framing started to shift from emphasizing the severity of the crisis to, can we just, get back to normal? And so we highlighted those differences in coverage and also showed, how corporate media was often contradicting itself and sending messages that seemed to, cancel each other out. And these things can be hard to pick up on when you're just like passively consuming the news. But when you see it sort of laid out, especially after students have done, the legwork to find it, I think it can be really illuminating for students and how they interpret information as they're following, issues that interest them.
Yeah, and very well put, Shealeigh, and very important to think about that. And in a lot of ways, when media expand the frame, of news coverage, they're really expanding the Overton window, so to speak. More and more things then become on people's radar, and they may even be things that people were thinking about, that they were already concerned about, but because it's not covered in the legacy press, or they don't see other people talking about it, they're maybe discouraged from bringing it up. These are great things to be doing in the classroom. And Andy, we only have a couple minutes left, unfortunately, because there's so much great stuff in the guide. Maybe you can leave us with just a couple of your thoughts on maybe how people could use the guide. It's available, of course, at the website. Maybe have a few words about that, Andy Lee Roth.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say right off the bat, like if you go to the Project Censored website, you can find the Beyond Fact Checking guide available under the Classroom tab. Shealeigh and I also wrote a dispatch article, a short kind of overview that Project Censored published back in September called "The Power of News Frames," that provides more of a take. But just kind of by way of wrapping, I think the point of the guide is to alert anyone who engages in it, especially students in classrooms, that framing is a fundamental but overlooked component of news literacy. And one reason to examine framing is, in addition to what Shealeigh mentioned before, that factual accuracy matters, but news can be misleading news can be factually accurate, but still misleading because of how it's framed. And so part of where we leave off the guide is that by learning how to examine news frames, to recognize that there are frames and to begin to appreciate how they shape our understanding, it allows us to understand that there's the potential for competing interpretations, and that the news isn't a simple reflection of a fixed reality, right? So when we have news frames that treat inequality as inevitable or abuses of power as natural, That's the result of specific choices that news producers have made. And we can question those choices. The ability to evaluate news frames can be a small but important aspect of envisioning a more inclusive, just, and sustainable world. And that's really, to me, the ultimate goal of treating frame checking as an essential tool in the critical media literacy toolkit.
Absolutely. Beyond fact checking, a teaching guide to the power of news frames. It's available for free at projectcensored.org in the classroom section. Lee Roth, Associate Director of Project Censored, Shealeigh Voitl, Digital and Print Editor, both co-editors of Project Censored State of the Free Press 2025 and co-authors of the Teaching Guide to Power of News Frames. Andy and Shealeigh, thank you so much for joining us on the Project Censored show today. So many things to think about, to consider, and especially in terms of the critical media literacy pedagogy. There's things we can do. We don't have to just feel powerless. And I know many people, after the election are feeling really down and concerned. But I think it's a time that we can also be really proactive, really engaged. And I think critical media literacy education gives us all the tools we need to try to decode and understand what's happening, and also maybe help us build a more just and equitable news media system. Andy, Shealeigh, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Good to talk.
Thanks, Mickey.